Flight attendant denies service to a doctor, assuming he's just another passenger. But moments later, she finds out he's a world-famous surgeon. What happens next will leave you stunned. Stay tuned to find out how one snap judgment changed everything. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was a regular afternoon flight. The cabin was calm, passengers settled into their seats, and the flight attendant Laura moved down the aisle offering drinks. Among the passengers, one man stood out. He looked well dressed, but there was something about his demeanor that made him seem different from the others. He wasn't the type to make small talk or draw attention. As Laura passed by, he politely asked for a glass of water. She didn't even pause. She glanced at him, quickly judged his appearance, and continued on her way, ignoring the request. Laura was new to the airline, eager to impress her supervisors and keep the routine smooth. She'd learned in training that certain passengers could be difficult. They could ask for things, demand attention, or make complaints. This man, based on his clothes and the way he carried himself, seemed like someone who might not fit the ideal passenger type. Without a second thought, Laura moved on, assuming he wasn't a priority. The man sat quietly, looking out the window as the plane began to cruise at a steady altitude. He didn't seem bothered, just patient. Meanwhile, Laura continued serving drinks and snacks, avoiding eye contact with him. She moved past, offering service to others, never once considering his request for water. She didn't think much of it, until a few minutes later when a sudden announcement interrupted the routine. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, and everyone in the cabin went silent. "We'd like to recognize a special guest on board today," the captain said, pausing for effect. "Dr. John Roberts, world-renowned surgeon, is traveling with us." At that moment, Laura's eyes widened. She looked over to the man who had remained in his seat, calm and unnoticed. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The man she had ignored was a highly respected doctor, someone whose work had saved lives around the world. She had denied him something as simple as a glass of water. A knot tightened in her stomach as the announcement continued, highlighting Dr. Roberts' groundbreaking surgeries and his impact on the medical community. Laura felt a wave of embarrassment rush over her. She had made an assumption without knowing anything about him, and now it was too late to undo the mistake. Everyone else on the plane seemed to treat the situation differently now. Whispers started, and people began to look at Laura with disapproval, while Dr. Roberts sat silently, unaffected. Laura's face turned red, and for the rest of the flight she couldn't stop thinking about the moment she'd passed him by. Too quick to judge, the rest of the flight dragged on for Laura. She couldn't shake the weight of her mistake. Every time she walked past Dr. Roberts, she felt his presence like an uncomfortable reminder. The other passengers too seemed to notice the tension. They started to avoid looking at Laura, as if they already knew what had happened. The worst part was how calm Dr. Roberts remained. He didn't glare at her, didn't even acknowledge the attention the announcement had caused. He just sat there, still, staring out of the window. Laura couldn't help but replay the situation in her mind. She had been in a hurry, thinking about the other passengers trying to stay on schedule. But now it felt like that one decision had cost her everything. She had judged him based on the way he looked, assuming he didn't need special attention. The truth was, she hadn't even thought to ask him who he was, to make sure he was comfortable or had everything he needed. She just assumed that a quiet man in a neat suit wouldn't need anything more. She kept glancing back at him, but Dr. Roberts never looked up from the window. He was the picture of calm, untouched by the attention he had suddenly gained. The other flight attendants had also heard the announcement, and now they seemed to treat him differently, offering him drinks, snacks, and even checking in with him. Laura felt the shift in the air. They were all treating him like someone important, someone deserving of respect. She had failed to see that right away. The worst part wasn't just the fact that she'd ignored his request. It was how easily she had overlooked his worth. The shame started to settle in her chest. She kept telling herself she was just doing her job, but deep down she knew that wasn't the real issue. The real problem was her quick judgment, her unwillingness to see beyond what was right in front of her. And now, there was nothing she could do to fix it. The hours passed, and Laura continued to serve drinks and snacks, feeling the weight of each interaction. As the plane began its descent, she tried to focus on her duties, but her mind kept drifting back to Dr. Roberts. What would he think when the flight ended? Would he say something? Would he complain? The fear was starting to feel overwhelming. She was certain that she'd made a bad impression, and there was no way to undo it now. She had been careless, and now she would have to live with that mistake. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign blinked off, the tension in the cabin seemed to lift. But for Laura, the feeling remained heavy. She moved through the aisles, offering her usual goodbyes, but her mind kept racing. When the plane finally came to a full stop at the gate, she knew her shift wasn't over yet. She still had to help with deboarding, and she had to face Dr. Roberts. When the passengers began standing and gathering their things, Laura saw him again. Dr. Roberts had stood up, gathering his carry-on bag. He moved slowly toward the exit, still calm, still composed. As he passed by, Laura caught a glimpse of him. She almost couldn't look him in the eye. What could she possibly say? It was then that she saw him stop. He didn't look at her, but he turned toward the flight attendants near the exit. "Excuse me," he said in a calm voice. "Could you thank the captain for the kind announcement? I appreciate the recognition, but I don't need any special treatment. I'm just another passenger." Laura froze. She hadn't expected that response at all. She thought he might confront her, ask why she hadn't given him that simple service. Instead, he was speaking to another attendant, downplaying his importance, as though his position in the world didn't matter. She could feel her cheeks flush. This was not the reaction she had imagined. She was prepared for him to be angry, maybe even scornful. But no, he was gracious. Too gracious. Dr. Roberts turned and walked towards the door, but before he stepped off the plane, he paused again. He looked directly at Laura, and for the first time their eyes met. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. She felt a strange mix of relief and guilt wash over her. He hadn't called her out. He hadn't made a scene. But in that single glance, she felt the weight of his quiet judgment. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew what she had done. And still, he didn't lash out. He simply left the plane, disappearing into the crowd of passengers. Laura stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where he had been. She hadn't expected this. She'd been bracing for anger, maybe even a complaint to her manager. Instead, she was left with nothing but silence and the overwhelming realization of how wrong she had been. The next few hours were a blur for Laura. She finished her shift and left the airport, but her mind kept circling back to what had happened. It wasn't just the embarrassment of the moment that bothered her. It was the weight of the mistake itself. She couldn't stop thinking about how quickly she had judged Dr. Roberts based on his appearance. How could she have been so careless? As she sat down at home, she tried to shake off the lingering guilt. But no matter what she did, the image of him sitting there, calm and unbothered, wouldn't leave her mind. He hadn't confronted her, hadn't made her feel small in front of the other passengers. He had simply moved on with his life, showing grace when she expected anger. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the gravity of her error. This wasn't just about a simple request for water. It was about how often we make assumptions about people without knowing anything about their lives, their struggles, or their achievements. Laura picked up her phone and searched Dr. Roberts' name. What she found stunned her. Articles, interviews, and stories about him filled the screen. He wasn't just a respected doctor. He was one of the most renowned surgeons in the world. He had pioneered techniques that saved countless lives, had been featured in medical journals, and was a leader in his field. The man she had dismissed so easily was someone whose work had touched the lives of thousands, if not millions, of people. The reality hit her even harder. She hadn't just overlooked a passenger. She had underestimated a man whose impact on the world was immeasurable. What kind of person had she become that she could so easily make such a snap judgment? For the rest of the evening, She couldn't stop reading about him. The more she learned, the more ashamed she felt. She couldn't shake the thought of how she had treated him like just another passenger, when in fact, he was someone who deserved far more respect and acknowledgement than she had given him. She knew she couldn't change what had happened, but she vowed to never make the same mistake again. The lesson was clear, but the guilt remained. Laura felt like she had been given a wake-up call, one she couldn't ignore. She had learned something that day, but at a cost. The following days were difficult for Laura. She couldn't stop replaying the encounter in her head. Every time she saw a passenger on a flight, she couldn't help but wonder, what if they weren't who they seemed? What if they had a story far greater than anything she could imagine? It was a constant reminder that we only see the surface of people's lives, and the judgments we make can be entirely wrong. Laura was a good person. She knew that. But this experience had opened her eyes to how easily she could fall into the trap of judging others. She had been quick to make assumptions based on appearances, and that had cost her more than just her peace of mind. It had cost her the chance to truly understand someone, to appreciate them for who they were, not just what they looked like. It wasn't until a week later, when she was working another flight, that she got another reminder of her lesson. Laura was serving drinks again, walking through the aisles with her tray, when a passenger flagged her down. She stopped, ready to go through her usual routine. But then the passenger spoke. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said. "I had a really bad day before this flight, and just your kindness made a huge difference." Laura paused. She had been ready to move on, but something about the woman's words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. The woman wasn't saying anything extraordinary. She wasn't asking for anything special. She was just acknowledging the small act of kindness that Laura had shown by offering her a drink with a smile. But for Laura, it felt like a full circle moment. She realized that kindness wasn't just about big gestures. It was about treating everyone with respect, no matter who they were, no matter what they looked like. She remembered Dr. Roberts and how, despite her mistake, he had shown her grace. And now, she was realizing that showing kindness, even in small ways, could change someone's day for the better. As the flight went on, Laura thought about Dr. Roberts again. She still felt the sting of her mistake, but now there was something else, something more positive she had learned, and she would never forget that lesson. She could only hope that someday she would have the chance to show him that she had grown, even if that opportunity never came. For now, though, all she could do was try to be better. The weeks that followed were a mix of growth and reflection for Laura. Each flight seemed to bring new challenges, but also a deeper understanding of how her previous actions had impacted both her and others. She'd started making a conscious effort to treat every passenger with respect, no matter how they presented themselves or how quiet they were. But even with these small changes, Dr. Roberts' face continued to linger in her thoughts. He had unknowingly become a symbol of her mistake, a mistake that wasn't just about denying service, but about the kind of person she never wanted to be. Laura's mindset began to shift as she took the time to truly observe her interactions with people. She noticed more often now how the people she came across were complex, layered individuals with stories she would never know unless she took the time to listen. It wasn't just about serving drinks or checking off tasks. It was about connecting with others, even in the smallest ways. She started to ask more questions, to be more aware of her own biases, and to step outside the routine of her job. One afternoon, as she worked a particularly busy flight, a woman in her mid-30s caught her attention. The woman had been quiet and reserved, sitting by herself, not engaging much with anyone around her. Laura served her a drink with a smile, but the woman looked up at her and said, "Thank you for being so kind. It's been a tough week." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Laura's immediate thought was to offer a sympathetic response, but instead she paused. She had learned from her past mistake. Assumptions about people's lives were dangerous. Instead of responding with something general, she asked, "Is everything okay?" "You don't have to share, of course, but I'm here if you need someone to talk to." The woman looked at her, taken aback. as if the simple question had caught her off guard. She nodded slowly. "It's just a lot. Family stuff, personal stuff. I guess it's hard when you feel like you're carrying the weight of everything on your own." She forced a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Laura felt a connection to her in that moment, a reminder of how everyone had their own struggles, their own weight they carried. No one was as simple as their outward appearance or the face they showed to the world. Laura realized how much she had missed by not engaging with others on a deeper level. This woman wasn't just a passenger. She was a person going through something real, something painful. And here Laura was, seeing her for the first time, not as a passenger to serve, but as a person who needed compassion. Their conversation didn't last long, but it stuck with Laura. It wasn't about offering advice, or even about knowing the details of the woman's life. It was about the willingness to be there, to be present, to listen. And in that moment, Laura realized that her mistake with Dr. Roberts wasn't just about missing a chance to offer service. It was about missing the chance to truly see someone for who they were. That evening, as Laura finished her shift and sat down on the bus ride home, she thought about the woman she'd talked to. She thought about how simple the conversation had been, and yet how much it had meant. And she couldn't help but think of Dr. Roberts again. Would he have reacted the same way as the woman, with kindness and grace? Would he have been forgiving of her mistake? Or would he have expected more? She couldn't change the past, but she had the present. And now, with each new person she met, Laura knew she had the power to show up differently. She had the power to see people for who they truly were, not just who she assumed them to be. It was a lesson that would stick with her for a long time, and one that had, in the end, made her a better person, both in her work and in her life. Months passed, but the lessons Laura had learned continued to shape her approach to life and work. She didn't forget Dr. Roberts, and she never stopped reflecting on what that experience had taught her. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being aware, present, and committed to understanding others in a way she hadn't before. She had realized that it wasn't just about treating people well in the moment. It was about changing her mindset, the way she viewed and interacted with every person she met. Her newfound approach was evident on her flights. Laura had started to take her time with passengers, engaging with them when she could. She wasn't just offering service anymore. She was looking for the stories behind the faces, and slowly, she noticed a shift. People responded differently to her. A few months ago, she would have just handed out drinks and moved on. Now, when she passed by someone, she made eye contact, gave a genuine smile, and sometimes asked a simple question. That small change in attitude made a world of difference. One afternoon, Laura found herself working a flight to a city she'd never been to before. The flight was relatively quiet, with most passengers already settled in. But there was a particular woman sitting in the back of the plane who caught her attention. She was older than most of the other passengers, probably in her late 60s, with silver hair neatly tucked into a bun and glasses perched at the tip of her nose. The woman was reading a book, but her body language suggested she was a little uneasy. Every few minutes she'd glance out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Laura approached her with a warm smile, but the woman barely looked up. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, nervousness perhaps, but she didn't say anything. Laura felt that familiar urge to just move on, but this time she resisted it. Instead, she took a breath and asked, "How's your flight going so far? Is there anything I can get you?" The woman looked up at her, startled at first, and then her face softened. "Oh, it's fine, well, I'm a little nervous," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't flown in years. My son wanted me to visit him, but I'm not really comfortable with flying anymore." Laura sat down beside her for a moment, noticing the woman's hands were trembling slightly. Instead of brushing her off or simply offering a drink and moving on, Laura asked gently, "Do you fly often, or is this a rare trip for you?" The woman's lips curled into a faint smile. "Oh, this is my first time in ages. I've been avoiding it." But I promised my son I'd visit, so here I am." Something about her vulnerability resonated with Laura. "I can understand that," she said with a kind nod. "Flying can feel overwhelming sometimes, but you're doing great, you know. You're already halfway there." The woman's smile widened, and Laura could see the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. For the rest of the flight, they talked off and on. The woman told Laura about her son and how much she loved him, but how her fear of flying had kept her away from him for years. They discussed little things, books, hobbies, even favorite foods, and slowly, the woman began to relax. When the plane started its descent, the woman gave her a soft, "Thank you," and Laura knew it wasn't just for the drink she had offered. As the plane touched down, Laura felt a strange sense of fulfillment. It wasn't that she had done anything particularly extraordinary. She had simply taken the time to engage, to listen, and to be present in a way she hadn't been before, and the woman had appreciated it. The small conversation, the simple acknowledgement of her fear and her bravery in facing it, had made all the difference. Laura couldn't help but think back to how far she had come since that day with Dr. Roberts. Back then, she would have brushed the woman off, not even noticing her discomfort. She would have simply handed out her service and moved on, thinking of her job as just that, a job. But now, every interaction felt different. Every person was a story waiting to be heard, a person whose life and experiences were far deeper than the surface she had once been so quick to judge. As she finished up the flight and started to leave the plane, Laura caught a glimpse of the woman one last time. The nervousness was gone from her face. Instead, there was a quiet confidence there, a calmness that hadn't been there when they first spoke. Laura smiled to herself, feeling the warmth of that small connection. She had learned so much from Dr. Roberts, but now she was learning from every person she met, realizing that everyone had their own struggles, their own triumphs, and their own stories to tell. And this was just the beginning. A few weeks later, Laura found herself standing at the gate for yet another flight, but this time, there was something different in the air. The lessons she'd learned hadn't faded. She was still making the conscious effort to see people, not just passengers, but real, complex human beings, each with their own lives and struggles. It felt like a shift inside her, something deeper than just doing her job more carefully. It was as if she had finally begun to see the world through a more open lens, one that invited understanding and empathy, rather than assumption. It was a busy morning, the kind where the airport was packed, and every plane seemed to be running on tight schedules. As she checked the boarding list for the flight, her eyes landed on a name. It was a familiar name. For a moment she thought it was a coincidence, but then her heart skipped. Dr. Roberts. She knew that name, and suddenly, the weight of that encounter from months ago resurfaced. She had tried to move on, to learn from her mistake, but here was the very person who had unknowingly changed her perspective. The feeling of guilt was still there, but now it was more of a quiet acknowledgement. Dr. Roberts wasn't just another person to her anymore. He was a reminder of a moment in her life that had shifted something fundamental. She stood at the gate, wondering if he would recognize her, if he would even remember the flight where she had been too quick to judge. Soon the passengers began boarding. Laura's heart was beating a little faster now. She was ready to do her job as usual, but part of her wondered what she would do when he came through the door. She told herself to stay calm, to act like everything was normal, but inside she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. And then, there he was. Dr. Roberts walked onto the plane with his usual calm demeanor. This time, however, there was no announcement about his identity, no special recognition. He was just another passenger among many. He smiled politely at Laura as he passed her, but there was no sign of the confrontation she had feared. He didn't give her any angry looks, didn't mention the past, didn't say a word about that moment when she had dismissed him. Instead, he simply walked past her and took his seat, as though nothing had ever happened. Laura stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where he had just been. For a second, she almost felt the urge to apologize, to rush to him and explain how much she had learned since their last encounter. But then she stopped herself. Apologizing in the middle of the aisle would feel awkward, forced, and insincere. She didn't need to apologize right then. What she needed to do was show him, through her actions, that she had grown. As the flight went on, Laura did what she always did. She moved through the cabin, offering drinks, talking to passengers, making sure everyone was comfortable. But now, her interactions were more thoughtful, more intentional. She was slower, more present, aware of each person's unique needs. She saw how much her attitude had shifted. She treated everyone with the same respect, whether they were quiet, outgoing, young, or old. It was something that had become natural now. Dr. Roberts never said anything about their past encounter, and Laura didn't expect him to. But there was a moment toward the end of the flight when, as she walked past his seat, he looked up and gave her a nod, a simple acknowledgement. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it meant everything to her. In that small, quiet moment, Laura realized that he had recognized her change. He hadn't forgotten, but he also hadn't held on to the past. He had moved on, and so had she. As the plane began its descent and the crew prepared for landing, Laura reflected on everything that had brought her here. Dr. Roberts had never needed to say anything to make her understand the lesson she had learned. The lesson wasn't just about that one mistake. It was about how we approach everyone in our lives. Whether it's a passenger on a flight or someone you see every day, the truth is that everyone has a story that's as complex as your own. Laura had learned to look beyond the surface, to listen, and to treat everyone with empathy and respect, no matter what. When the plane landed, the passengers began to stand up and gather their belongings. As Dr. Roberts moved toward the door, he looked at Laura one more time. This time his smile was warmer, less guarded. He didn't stop to speak, but his look conveyed everything she needed to know. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. He was simply acknowledging the person she had become. Laura watched him leave, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle in her chest. The encounter hadn't been about a grand moment of reconciliation. It hadn't been about making up for the mistakes she'd made. It had been about learning, about growing, and about becoming someone who saw others as more than just faces in a crowd. It had been about taking a mistake and using it as fuel to do better. As she closed the cabin door after the last of the passengers had disembarked, Laura stood there for a moment, reflecting on the journey she had been on, not just in her career, but in her understanding of people. Dr. Roberts had unknowingly been the catalyst for her growth, and in the end, that was all she could have asked for. The weeks that followed felt different for Laura. There was a new calm in her approach to her job, a deeper sense of purpose that she hadn't felt before. Every flight, every interaction seemed to carry more weight now. It wasn't just about getting through the day or performing her duties without incident. She started seeing passengers in a different light. It wasn't that she had changed overnight, but each moment, each encounter, was a reminder of how much more there was to every person than what met the eye. One particular flight stood out. It was a full flight packed with passengers from all walks of life. There was a buzz in the air as people settled in, talking and laughing. As Laura moved down the aisle, she caught a glimpse of an elderly man sitting by the window. He had a kind face, but there was something about the way he held himself that made Laura pause. His eyes were closed, and his hands were folded tightly in his lap. It didn't take much to notice that something seemed off. Instead of walking past, as she might have once done, Laura stopped and asked gently, "Is everything okay, sir? Would you like anything to drink?" The man opened his eyes slowly, almost surprised by the question. He gave her a small smile, but it was a tired, worn smile, one that told a story. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was soft, as though the effort to speak was more than he could muster. "Just a little nervous. First time flying in years." Laura nodded, recognizing the discomfort. She had seen it before. The fear of flying wasn't uncommon, but it always seemed more acute when someone hadn't flown in a long time. "I understand. I'm here if you need anything, okay?" she said, offering him a reassuring smile before moving on. But something in her gut told her to check in on him again. About an hour later, after she had made her rounds, she passed by his seat again. This time he was staring out the window, his hands still clenched tightly. There was an uneasy tension in his posture, and Laura's heart went out to him. She stopped again. "Sir, can I get you anything? It's okay if you're feeling anxious. Flying can be overwhelming." The man looked at her, his face crinkling in a way that revealed his age and his worry. "I'm not worried about the flight," he said, his voice trembling now. "It's my daughter. She's been very sick for a long time. I'm going to see her, but I'm not sure I'm going to make it in time. I've missed so much already." He looked down, his eyes filled with a sadness that wasn't just about the flight, but about a lifetime of regrets and missed moments. Laura stood there for a moment, taking it all in. She didn't rush him, didn't try to offer hollow words of comfort. She simply listened. "I'm really sorry," she said softly, trying her best to convey her empathy without being overly sentimental. "I know it's hard, but I'm sure your daughter is lucky to have you on your way." The elderly man nodded, his eyes misty. "I just wish I'd done more sooner, you know. But it's never too late, I hope." It was one of those moments that stayed with Laura long after the flight was over. She didn't know the man's full story, didn't know how things would turn out for him or his daughter, but she knew one thing. He had carried this burden with him for a long time, and it had shaped the person he was. This wasn't just an old man on a plane. This was a father, someone who had lived through pain and regret, someone who was holding on to the hope that he wasn't too late to make things right. The rest of the flight passed in a blur, but Laura kept thinking about that conversation. She hadn't solved the man's problems. She hadn't taken away his fears or made his journey any easier, but she had listened. She had given him space to talk about something that clearly weighed heavily on his heart. She thought back to Dr. Roberts and the way he had taught her, without even knowing it, that people weren't just the roles they played. They were their histories, their struggles, their hopes and dreams. By the time the plane landed, Laura felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had learned something from that interaction, just as she had learned from so many others. She had seen the elderly man for who he was, not just a passenger with a quiet demeanor, but a person in the middle of a life-altering journey. She had made an effort to understand him, and that small act of kindness had made a difference, no matter how minor it might have seemed in the grand scheme of things. As passengers began to exit the plane, the elderly man smiled at Laura. His earlier anxiety softened. He thanked her for her kindness, and though his words were simple, they held more meaning than she could express. It wasn't just the drink she had offered him. It was the time she had taken to listen to his pain, to give him a space where he could release a little bit of the pressure he'd been carrying. That moment was a reminder for Laura, another piece in the puzzle she was putting together of who she was becoming. Every passenger she met, every conversation, no matter how brief, was an opportunity to connect on a human level, to show empathy, and to move beyond the surface. Dr. Roberts had taught her that people's lives were always more complicated than what you saw. This elderly man had shown her that even the smallest act of listening could make someone feel seen, heard, and understood. And that, more than anything else, was the kind of service she wanted to provide. The flight crew gathered their things, preparing to disembark, but Laura stood for a moment thinking back to that conversation. She had learned something invaluable today, something that couldn't be taught in a training manual or learned from a flight checklist. She had learned that kindness wasn't just about doing your job well. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone you came across, no matter who they were or what their story might be. It was about taking a second to see beyond the surface and to offer a little bit of compassion, especially when it wasn't expected. That lesson wasn't just for her job. It was something she could carry with her every day, in every interaction, with every person. And for Laura, that made all the difference. As the days turned into weeks, Laura's transformation was more than just a shift in how she approached her work. It had become a core part of who she was. She wasn't just doing her job with more care and attention. She was becoming more aware of the people around her, more conscious of the impact her actions and words could have. The weight of the lessons she had learned from Dr. Roberts, from the elderly man and from every passenger who had opened up to her, stayed with her, shaping her interactions in ways that she hadn't imagined possible when she first started her career. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when she had to fight the urge to slip back into autopilot, to treat passengers like just another task to check off. It was easy to get caught up in the grind of daily routines, dealing with irritable passengers, managing flight delays, ensuring everything ran smoothly. But more often than not, the faces of the people she had met along the way would appear in her mind, reminding her that there was more to them than what met the eye. She had started seeing the humanity in the faces of strangers, and it changed everything about how she saw the world. One afternoon, while preparing for another flight, Laura found herself dealing with a particularly stressful situation. A family had boarded, and the father appeared to be visibly upset. He was arguing with the flight attendants about seating arrangements, his voice rising with each passing minute. Laura had seen her fair share of confrontations, but something about this one felt different. The father was demanding a different seat, despite the flight being fully booked, and he was growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of options. For a moment, Laura felt the familiar urge to simply move on, to let the flight attendants handle the situation and avoid getting involved. But then she remembered the lessons of patience and understanding that had been drilled into her. She couldn't ignore this. She knew deep down that there was more to this than just a seating issue. She walked over to the family, giving them a calm, welcoming smile. The father didn't immediately respond, his face twisted in irritation, but Laura wasn't deterred. She waited for him to settle down for a moment before speaking. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. "I can see you're upset, and I want to help if I can." For a second, the man didn't say anything, but then his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he looked at her, his frustration still evident but softer. "It's just, we've been through a lot. My wife's been in the hospital for weeks, and I'm trying to keep things together for the kids. It's just a lot right now, you know." His voice was quieter now, less sharp, but still carrying the weight of his stress. Laura nodded, understanding the tension that so often came with family struggles. "I'm really sorry to hear that," she said. "It must be really difficult for all of you." She didn't rush to offer a solution, she just let him talk. "It's hard to deal with everything, especially when you're trying to be strong for your family. I completely understand the frustration." The father sighed, a deep breath that seemed to let some of the tension go. He glanced at his children, who were sitting quietly, their eyes wide and confused by the situation. "I'm just trying to make things as easy as possible for them," he admitted, "but I feel like everything's slipping away." Laura stood there, listening, letting him speak. It was a small moment, but for that brief exchange, the man had let his guard down. He didn't feel like a customer demanding something. He was a father, struggling with the weight of his own life. It reminded her so much of the elderly man she had spoken to weeks before, someone trying to navigate through a hard moment, seeking understanding rather than judgment. "I can't change the situation right now," Laura said, "but I can see you're doing your best, and that means a lot." She took a step back, then offered a suggestion. "Let me see if I can help with some rearranging. Maybe we can make this flight a little more comfortable for you." It wasn't a grand gesture. There were no major changes to be made, no magic solution to the problem. But the way she had approached the situation was different from how she might have handled it in the past. Instead of reacting to the anger and frustration with irritation or impatience, she chose to listen. She chose to empathize, and in the end, that made all the difference. The father softened, and after a few minutes, they were able to find a solution that worked for everyone. The family settled in, and Laura felt a sense of relief. But it wasn't just the resolution that mattered. It was the way she had handled it, with patience and care, acknowledging the stress the man was under and allowing him to feel heard. As the flight continued, Laura reflected on what had just happened. This wasn't just about making a family more comfortable on a flight. It was about understanding that people's frustrations often came from places deeper than what was on the surface. She had learned to ask the right questions, to take a moment to listen, and to look beyond the immediate issue. and as a result, she had transformed a tense situation into one where both sides felt understood. Later, as she wrapped up the flight and watched the family deboard, the father gave her a nod of appreciation. His earlier frustration had faded, replaced with a genuine thanks. He didn't say much, but his eyes conveyed everything. It was one of those moments when Laura realized how much she had changed. She wasn't perfect, no one was, but she was more aware, more empathetic, more present. And that was a step in the right direction. Every passenger she met now felt like a reminder that everyone had a story to tell, and that the surface only scratched the surface of who they really were. And as long as she kept that in mind, she knew she was on the right path, both in her job and in her life. By the end of the day, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not from the smoothness of the flight or the tasks she had completed, but from the connections she had made along the way. Every moment, no matter how small, had its meaning, and she was learning to see it. Every time she chose to listen, to see beyond the surface, she felt herself growing. She wasn't just changing the way she worked, she was changing the way she saw the world. And that, she realized, was the most important change of all. As the months went on, Laura's understanding of people deepened. Each flight, each passenger felt like a new lesson in empathy, patience, and awareness. What had once been routine, an endless cycle of serving drinks, taking orders, and making polite conversation, had transformed into something far more meaningful. It wasn't that the mechanics of her job had changed, but the way she approached it had. Every moment became an opportunity to connect, to see beyond the face in front of her, and to offer something more than just service. She was now offering a piece of herself, a recognition of the human experience that existed in everyone she met. One day, as she prepared for another busy flight, she overheard a conversation between two passengers sitting in the row behind her. Their voices were quiet, but the tension in their words was palpable. One of the passengers, a man in his mid-30s, was explaining in a low, strained voice how he hadn't seen his mother in years. She had recently been diagnosed with cancer, and he was on his way to visit her for the first time in a long time. As he spoke, his words faltered, and there was a quiet pain behind them that Laura could hear even from her place near the front of the cabin. The woman sitting next to him, an older woman who appeared to be his aunt, was listening intently, offering her support with gentle words. But the man's anxiety was evident. His hands were shaking as he clutched the armrest, his eyes darting around the cabin as though the reality of the situation was suddenly hitting him all at once. He was traveling across the country to make amends, to try to rebuild a relationship that had been lost to time and misunderstandings. And though he was determined to face what was coming, there was no mistaking the fear in his voice, the fear of what he might find when he finally arrived. Laura couldn't help but overhear, and a deep empathy stirred in her chest. She had never met these people, but their pain felt real. It felt familiar, as though it were her own. She had seen so many people over the years, families, friends, strangers, who were dealing with the weight of regret, the weight of unspoken words, and the fear of the unknown. She knew that feeling well, that sense of uncertainty that comes with facing someone after time has passed, after things have been left unsaid. When the opportunity arose, Laura found herself walking down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks as usual. But this time, she made an intentional decision. Instead of simply moving past, she slowed down when she reached the man and his aunt. She didn't want to intrude, but something inside her told her that this was one of those rare moments when a small act of kindness could make a difference. She stopped for a moment, offering the man a warm, compassionate smile. "How are you doing?" she asked, her voice calm but sincere. The man looked up, surprised by the question, but his eyes softened as he met her gaze. "I'm okay," he said, his voice tight. "I'm just nervous. I haven't seen my mom in years, and I don't know if I can fix things." Laura nodded, understanding that kind of fear, that uncertainty of whether you could go back and make things right. "It's tough," she said gently. "But the fact that you're going, that you're taking that step, means a lot." I know it might feel scary right now, but sometimes just showing up is the most important part." The man's eyes dropped, and for a brief moment, Laura could see the conflict in him, the pain, the regret, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. He swallowed hard before speaking again, his voice quieter. "I've missed so much time. I don't even know where to start." Laura felt a pang of recognition. She had heard those words before, from others in similar situations, but each time they felt as fresh as the first. She could see the hesitation, the fear of reopening old wounds. But there was something in his voice that told her he was willing to try. "You don't have to have all the answers," she said softly. "Sometimes the best thing you can do is just show up and be there. Take it one step at a time. You don't have to fix everything in one moment. Just be present." The man looked up at her then, as though something in her words had connected. A flicker of relief passed over his face, and he gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I really appreciate that. It's hard, but I think you're right." Laura nodded, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. She didn't have the answers for him. She couldn't solve his problems or take away his fear. But in that moment she had given him something, the simple gift of being seen, of being heard. Sometimes that was all it took. Sometimes it was enough to know that someone understood. As she continued down the aisle, moving to the next row, she couldn't help but think about the power of those small moments. She had learned over the course of her time working as a flight attendant that it wasn't always about grand gestures. It wasn't always about the big, life-changing acts of kindness that made the difference. Often, it was about the small things, the quiet conversations, the moments of connection that left the most lasting impact. She thought back to her earlier interactions, the elderly man, the father with the sick child, and Dr. Roberts. All of them had taught her the same thing. People were more than their outward appearances or the roles they played. Everyone had a story, a history, and a reason for why they acted the way they did. And in the end, it was up to her to be the kind of person who took the time to understand that. By the end of the flight, when the man and his aunt were preparing to disembark, Laura glanced back at them. The man caught her eye, and this time he offered her a genuine smile, one that was no longer tinged with anxiety. She saw a change in him, something lighter, something more at peace. He wasn't fixed, but he was closer to being at ease with himself. And that, in itself, was enough. As she finished her duties and prepared to leave the plane, Laura felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Not because she had solved someone's problems, but because she had been present. She had taken the time to listen, to care, and to offer something that couldn't be measured: empathy. It was moments like these, she realized, that defined who she was becoming. Every day, every flight, she was learning to see people more clearly, not just as passengers or customers, but as human beings with their own stories, struggles, and dreams. And in each of those moments, she was learning how to show up as the person she wanted to be. A person who understood that kindness, patience, and a willingness to listen could change someone's day, even if only for a moment. That was the real reward of her work, and it was something that stayed with her long after the flight ended. By now, Laura had been with the airline for over a year, and the shifts were becoming more natural. The routines of boarding, taking off, and landing were second nature to her, but what kept each day fresh were the people she met. The passengers were no longer just faces in a crowd. They were individuals with unique stories, struggles, and hopes that each flight brought to light in unexpected ways. One day, during a particularly turbulent flight, Laura found herself reflecting on just how much she had changed since that first encounter with Dr. Roberts. The plane had been shaking more than usual, and the cabin had fallen into a tense silence. Passengers were gripping their armrests, exchanging uneasy glances. Normally, the sounds of anxiety in the cabin would have made Laura feel uneasy herself, but today she was different. She had learned to read the room, to understand the deeper fears and worries that lurked behind every face. The turbulence, though unsettling, didn't unsettle her as it might have in the past. Instead, she moved through the cabin with calm assurance. offering passengers reassurance when she could. She didn't offer false promises. She simply acknowledged their discomfort and let them know she was there to help. A woman near the front of the plane had been particularly anxious, her hands clutching the seat in front of her as she stared out the window, her knuckles white with tension. Laura approached her carefully. She didn't rush. She didn't try to offer empty words of comfort. She simply sat beside her for a moment, giving her space. "It's okay to feel nervous," Laura said softly. "Turbulence is unsettling, but it's normal. The plane is built to handle this." The woman turned toward her, her face drawn with worry, and nodded faintly. "I've never liked flying," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, I never know if I'm safe, and every time we hit turbulence I'm reminded of how little control I have." Laura recognized that feeling, the fear of being vulnerable, the helplessness that came with being at the mercy of something beyond your control. She had heard it before from other passengers, but there was something about this woman's words that struck a chord. "I get that," Laura replied with a nod. "The fear of the unknown can be overwhelming, but what I can tell you is that the crew is trained to handle situations like this. We're all in good hands." The woman's eyes met hers, and there was a brief flicker of gratitude. "Thank you for saying that. I don't know why I get so scared. I know it's irrational, but I can't help it." "You're not alone," Laura said with a small, reassuring smile. "A lot of people feel that way. It's okay to be scared, just as long as you know that fear doesn't control you." She gave the woman a moment to absorb the words, then added, "If you'd like, I can bring you a drink or anything to help take your mind off things. Just let me know." The woman shook her head, but the tension in her body had visibly eased. She gave Laura a small but sincere smile. "I appreciate it," she said, her voice still shaky but more at ease. "I think I'll be okay now." As Laura moved down the aisle to check on other passengers, she couldn't help but reflect on how much she had learned over the past year. It wasn't just about managing anxiety or diffusing tense situations. It was about truly understanding the human condition. She realized that she had become more attuned to what people needed, whether they needed a listening ear, a few kind words, or simply someone to sit with them during an uncomfortable moment. She no longer saw passengers as just customers to serve. She saw them as people who, for whatever reason, had chosen this moment in time to share their space with her, and she was determined to make that space a little better for them. The rest of the flight passed without incident, and as the plane began its descent, the cabin slowly filled with a more relaxed energy. Passengers were unbuckling their seatbelts, gathering their belongings, and preparing to leave. Laura went through the motions, but each movement felt more deliberate, more grounded in a sense of purpose. She was no longer just going through the motions of her job. She was actively participating in these people's stories, even if it was just for a few hours. And that connection, however fleeting, made everything feel more meaningful. As the plane touched down, the woman from earlier approached Laura as she was finishing up the last of her duties. She stopped in front of her with a genuine smile. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice warmer than before. "You helped calm me down. I don't know if you realize how much that means to someone like me." Laura felt a quiet sense of pride swell in her chest. It wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about solving every problem. But the simple act of connecting, of showing someone that they weren't alone in their fear, was enough to make a real difference. "I'm really glad I could help," Laura said. "It's what I'm here for." The woman gave her a nod of appreciation and left the plane, but Laura stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment. There had been a time when she would have simply dismissed this woman's anxiety, or perhaps offered some empty reassurance. But now, after everything she had learned, she knew that just being present, that was enough. People didn't need you to solve their problems. They didn't need you to take away their fear. They just needed someone to acknowledge their humanity, to show them that they weren't alone in their struggles. It was these moments that shaped her now. The quiet conversations, the small gestures of kindness, and the realization that every passenger was carrying something with them, whether it was fear, sadness, joy, or excitement. Her job, though it had begun as just another way to make a living, had become a window into the lives of hundreds of people, each with their own story. And it wasn't just the passengers who had taught her. She had learned so much about herself in the process. Through her interactions with people from all walks of life, she had discovered a deeper sense of purpose. She wasn't just a flight attendant. She was someone who day by day was learning to see the world through a different lens, one that was more compassionate, more empathetic, and more aware of the quiet, unseen struggles that others carried. When the plane landed and the passengers disembarked, Laura walked off the aircraft with a sense of quiet fulfillment. She had done her job, yes, but more importantly, she had connected with the people she had met, even in small ways. And in the end, that was what made all the difference. Every connection, every moment of understanding was a reminder that we are all human, navigating our own battles, and that the smallest act of kindness could make someone's day a little easier. And for Laura, that was enough to make every flight worthwhile. It was nearly a year since Laura had started working as a flight attendant, and as she walked through the terminal after her latest flight, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of fulfillment settle in her chest. The airport was bustling with activity, the usual sounds of announcements and rolling luggage filling the air. But in that moment, it felt like everything had slowed down for her. She wasn't just passing through the motions anymore. She wasn't just counting down the hours until the end of her shift. The work had become something more, something deeper. Laura had learned that it wasn't about how fast you could get through the day or how quickly you could serve drinks and snacks. It was about how much you could give, how much you could connect, how much you could truly see the people you were surrounded by. Each passenger, each face was a unique story unfolding before her eyes. It wasn't always easy to step out of the routine, to look beyond the task at hand. But the more she practiced it, the more natural it became. It was like a muscle. Empathy, understanding, patience, each interaction was a chance to strengthen that muscle, to build it up until it became second nature. She had learned to listen not just with her ears but with her heart. She had learned to recognize the subtle shifts in someone's body language, the slight tremor in their voice that signaled they were carrying something heavy. She had learned to be present, really present, in a world where people often moved too fast to notice the things that mattered. As she sat down on the bench in the terminal, waiting for her next flight, she reflected on the changes she had gone through in the past year. She thought about Dr. Roberts, the man she had wronged in the early days of her career. She hadn't been able to make amends directly with him, but she realized now that the apology wasn't necessary. The lesson he had unknowingly taught her, about seeing beyond appearances, about understanding people's deeper stories, had stuck with her, shaping every encounter since. She had carried that lesson with her into every flight, into every interaction. It had transformed her, made her a better listener, a better person, and most importantly, a better human being. And then there was the elderly man she'd met on the flight where he had been so nervous about his daughter's illness. His vulnerability had taught her that it wasn't always the dramatic moments or grand gestures that defined a person's life. Sometimes, it was the quiet struggles, the regrets, the unanswered questions that shaped us the most. He had been willing to share his pain, even in a fleeting moment on a plane, and that had left a mark on her. It had reminded her that everyone was carrying something, and that we all needed someone who would listen without judgment, someone who would meet us in those hard moments with kindness. Laura had become more than just a flight attendant. She had become a part of the emotional landscape of the people she met. She realized that while she couldn't change their situations, she could offer something far more powerful: understanding. She had learned that to truly help someone wasn't to solve their problems, but to show them that they were seen, that their experience mattered. It was the difference between simply serving someone and connecting with them on a deeper level. As she boarded her next flight, Laura felt a calm sense of purpose. The turbulence, the crying children, the last-minute seating changes, None of it bothered her the way it once might have. She was ready for whatever the day brought, knowing that the real work wasn't in the logistics of the flight, but in the way she interacted with the people on board. Every passenger, every face was a reminder that there was something more beneath the surface, something worth looking for. Halfway through the flight, Laura was making her usual rounds when she came across a young woman sitting near the back. She was sitting alone, staring out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. There was a quiet sadness in her posture, something that told Laura that this wasn't just a regular flight for her. The woman looked young, maybe in her mid-20s, but there was a heaviness in her demeanor that suggested she was carrying more than her years should bear. Laura stopped in front of her, giving her a gentle smile. "How's everything going?" she asked softly, aware of the vulnerability that seemed to hang in the air. The young woman blinked, clearly startled by the question. She had been lost in her thoughts, and it took a moment for her to register the flight attendant standing in front of her. "Oh," she said, her voice soft. "It's fine, I'm fine." Laura didn't press her. She knew that when someone said they were fine but looked far from it, there was usually something more. Instead, she offered a simple, "If you need anything, let me know. I'm here if you need someone to talk to." The woman hesitated, looking at Laura for a moment before she seemed to make up her mind. She let out a small sigh, and her eyes filled with tears. I'm on my way to see my dad. He's in the hospital, and I haven't seen him in years." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I don't know if he'll even remember me. I don't know if it's too late." The words hung in the air between them, and Laura could feel the weight of them pressing down. She could see the young woman's vulnerability, the fear of facing someone after so much time had passed. It was the same fear that so many people carried, the fear of regret, of not knowing how to rebuild a relationship that had been broken. Laura sat down next to her, her voice calm and steady. "It's never too late," she said softly. "You're taking the first step by showing up. That matters more than anything else." The woman looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as though she hadn't expected this kind of kindness, this kind of understanding. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would do without someone telling me that." "I'm sure it'll be okay," Laura replied, offering her a gentle smile. "The most important thing is that you're there, and I can tell you're ready to try." For the rest of the flight, the young woman seemed more at ease, her shoulders less tense. Laura continued her rounds, checking in with other passengers, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the woman's words. Every day, it seemed, she encountered these moments when someone's vulnerability was laid bare, moments when they just needed someone to hear them, to see them, to remind them that it wasn't too late to make a change. By the time the flight landed, the woman had thanked Laura again, her eyes a little clearer, her step a little lighter. As she exited the plane, Laura felt that same quiet satisfaction she had come to know so well. It wasn't about solving anyone's problems. It was about being there. It was about being the person who took a moment to listen, to understand, to offer something simple: kindness. As Laura left the airport that evening, she knew she had found something she hadn't expected when she first signed up for this job. She had found purpose, a deeper sense of connection to the people around her. She had found that through small acts of care, through seeing people for who they truly were, she could make a difference. It wasn't always grand and it wasn't always easy, but it was real. And that, more than anything, was what she had been searching for. Her work, her journey, had transformed into something meaningful. And as she stepped out into the night air, she realized that she had found her place, not just on the plane, but in the world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.